Welcome everyone to our Saturday evening Cybersquatch workshop / panel on it's a discussion on historical violence and modern HEMA with Kaja Sadowski and Charles Lin, the loveliest of folks. I'm going to be going through some announcements real quick before we jump on in. First off, my name is Shane Malone. We're very excited to have you all here. I've been a Squatch commander since year one. This is our 5th year of Swordsquatch. Our moderators on the channel are Michael Jarvey and Brent Wang. And they will be keeping an eye on Facebook Live as well as our Zoom chat specifically. And where I want people to focus if they have questions is there should be a Q&A button located at the bottom bar. If you have questions for Kaja or Charles, please direct your questions to that Q&A portion and then leave actual chat for just hanging out with each other in general comments. But if you have a question, again, please use that little Q&A bar. Quick reminders for the session: Black Lives Matter, be kind to one another. Be patient with any tech difficulties like I just had with going Facebook Live. If you fail to follow our code of conduct, we will have to ban you. If you need any assistance or question, again, use the Q&A box. Leave a comment in the box if it's specifically at one of our moderators if you need help that way. Let's see. Today, Saturday only, Purple Heart is Swordsquatch's sponsor for this year, and they sent us a quick video that they would like us to share. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and play that video. And then after that, we're just going to get to talking. All right, 1 second, folks.
Hi, and welcome back to the Purple Heart Armory table. I'm Natasha, and I wanted to show you one last batch of newer things that we have. First, I'll start with our new, what we're calling our economy forearms. Standard forearms, but we got them made in 2 different sizes. So standard, which is the size that you're probably used to, and then a little bit shorter. So for people like me with normal sized forearms, they fit a whole lot better and they don't cover up your elbow or your wrist for your gloves. So both sizes available on the website, and these also come with the elbows included. So you don't have to buy those separately in this pair. Then we also have the new knees, which have, if I can figure out how to open it, side wings. So standard hard shell on the front, padding on the inside, and then padded heavy duty wings to cover the sides all the way around. So these are fairly new. Next is our rapier gloves, which we've had forever, but we had some requests to make them in a vegan option. So this is actually an artificial leather on this style. We call it Rexine. That's just what our maker calls that material. So those are all available on the website in different sizes. Next is our new gorget. We've had some requests to sort of change up the gorget options, and so this one has a little bit more protection than some of the other versions that we have. So same as usual, hard front for the thorax protection, and then collarbone protection here. And then the side wings are a little bit shorter, so it doesn't impede your upper motion of your arms, but it does offer a little bit of extra protection on the side. So this is what we're calling our PHA gorget. Finally, so we had a Facebook post, Instagram post recently about our new collaboration with the Helgi's True History Shop. This is about all we have left. Everything else sold out. So these are flexible foam heads. So they're very safe to use, very shiny, very nice looking. Still hard, still pack a punch, but these are all sold out except for a few of these axe heads, but we're already working on our next order. We'll have those available probably in about 2 months from the date of this film. And then a nice option to go with it is the new Cold Steel Targe buckler. As you can see, it's a little bit bigger than the standard buckler, a little bit smaller than our large shield, has a good weight to it, has some nice detailing on it. And so I think what we're going to do is we're going to put together a kit, including one of these axes and the Targe. So look for those specials on our website. Well, thanks for everyone for coming to our table and shop the website, and we will see you at the next event in person, hopefully.
All right. Stop sharing my screen. And with that, I introduce Kaja Sadowski and Charles Lin. Let you folks take it away.
Uh, sure, I guess I'll start talking. So my name is Kaja Sadowski. I am one of the owners and coaches at Valkyrie Western Martial Arts Assembly up in Vancouver, Canada. I am the author of a book called Fear is the Mind Killer: How to Build a Training Culture that Fosters Strength and Resilience. And it's about community and culture building and pedagogy in martial arts and self-defense. As far as HEMA is concerned, I have been doing this for a little over 10 years now. And my focuses in terms of historical material are Marazzo for the most part, and I've also recently started working on Godinho's Two Swords. Yeah, that should do.
Cool. I guess I should go. My name is Charles Lin. I'm an instructor at Capital Kunstfestens near Washington, D.C. I've been doing HEMA for about 5.5 years, and my general focus, or my specific focus, is in German Kunstfestens. And I think generally my approach is as a generalist. I think people who know me just know me as someone who does a little bit of everything, and that's kind of where I like to be, just being able to understand what the experts of a given subfield think, but being able to try to cohere and put it together in interesting ways. But yeah, that's my deal. All right, so
There we go.
we have this we have all this content, and we never really thought about the format. I just kind of assumed it would be like a moderator or something like that. But is there anything that you want to get off, like right off the bat? I don't know.
So I think what I want to do is kind of give folks a rough idea of the framework that you and I came up with, and kind of use that as our guidance for getting going on this. And then really for folks in the audience, Charles and I kind of envisioned this as like, you know that bit of Swordsquatch, maybe at the Shindig, or really any other HEMA event in the evening, where people are drinking and you find somebody who is an expert in a field related to yours, and you just like corner them for an hour, and the two of you get to shoot the shit about whatever you're really interested in. This is basically just me and Charles doing that. It's us being excited about some of the areas where our interests overlap the most, which is in that business of violence, what it is, what it looks like, what it means, and like how it's a much more complex and nuanced thing than we often present it in HEMA, I think.
Yeah.
So as I showed, I think, to our earlier crew, we have a very well structured note with an adorable kitty cat on it, which lists all of our organizing questions. So we might as well start with that. And then Charles and I will start going. And if at any point you have questions, or you want to send us off on an exciting tangent, or you think what we're saying is stupid and you want to argue with us, that is what the Q&A is for. We will happily entertain everything you've got to throw at us until we run out of steam or everybody needs to go to bed. So the rough framework that Charles and I had was starting with talking about categorizing violence. So maybe throwing around some of the frameworks or the paradigms that we use or that we're familiar with, just to kind of get the ball rolling for thinking about violence as a multifaceted thing. Then we had looking at modern paradigms for defense and the potential problems that they might cause when we're thinking about HEMA. Then we had, okay, well, what does that even mean as we try to apply it to HEMA? How does that frame our thinking? Yeah. Why, Charles and Kaja, why do you care about this? Then we wanted to do a segue into manuscripts and book culture and how that affects interpretation, because this is another thing that Charles and I both get very excited about. And then kind of wrap up with some really practical questions about how we can take this more nuanced, this more informed understanding of violence and bring it into our actual training and use it to inform the physical things we do, as well as the researchy, geeky things that we do. And then we kind of had some extra questions and possible problems to bring up around that. Charles, does that sound about right?
Yep, perfect.
Cool. So yeah, that's what we're gonna do. We should talk.
All right. Yeah, we should start talking now. Okay, so I guess like one of the questions I was thinking just more deeply, which is like, what are the general ways, what are the general buckets that one could like place violence in, right? I know in your book you have several methods or several features of violence that you use to categorize them. Do you use that for HEMA? Do you think that is, or would you want to give a quick summary of that and then, talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So when I talk about violence, and this is in the stress testing chapter of my book for folks who are familiar with it, what I basically do is I break it down into 3 binary pairs that kind of address different features of violence. So there is play versus earnest violence, there is social versus asocial, and then there's symmetrical versus asymmetrical. And my contention in the book, and it's something that I still think is like reasonably accurate, is that if you can kind of cover those, if you can categorize violence within those 3 sections, you have a pretty good big picture sense of what you're dealing with, and you can use it to inform how you structure things like training scenarios, how you build drills, and how you think about the stuff that you're dealing with. So yeah, I do think it's absolutely relevant to HEMA, and I often use it as a starting point. Just to kind of give a quick summary, our first pair is play versus earnest violence. And the way I think about that is the point to, is the violence the point? Are we actually trying to harm people? Are we actually trying to do damage? Or are we using violence as a toy or a training tool or a mode of entertainment that's got really strict limitations on how it gets used? And that's kind of the biggest defining feature of play violence for me, is that there are rules built into it that are designed to mitigate the harm it causes. So for example, the sparring that we do in HEMA is play violence. And in order to not actually kill people every time that we do it, or at least break their bones, we wear armor, we use blunt weapons rather than sharp ones. We disallow certain kinds of strikes that we consider overly debilitating, all of that kind of stuff. So we put in a whole bunch of rules to make it acceptably safe. Earnest violence would be actually just fighting with sharp swords. It would be violence where the point is to do some harm. That doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have any rules around it, but it does mean that you're not doing it in order to learn or in order to score points, etc. So that's kind of categorization 1. Categorization 2, it overlaps a fair bit but isn't the same, is social versus asocial violence. And this originally came right out of some of the self-defense writing that Rory Miller does. And I've adapted it for my own purposes. So social violence is violence that is intended to communicate something other than ouch. It might be intended to make you look good in front of your peers or in front of, a potential partner that you're trying to impress. It might be to show somebody that they do or don't belong in a particular space. It might be to kind of delineate the boundaries of territory, something like that. It's violence that serves a social function. That's intended to kind of control how people relate to each other or communicate something about people's social standing. So, for example, again, a HEMA match is not only is it play violence because it's a game, but it's also social violence because it's mostly about showing off for your friends or, you know, improving your HEMA rankings so that people will come train at your club or whatever. I don't compete, I don't know. Whereas something like a duel with sharp weapons would be earnest violence. It's ouchy and deliberately so, but it's still social violence. It's still engaged in those communicative social status games. The flip side of that is asocial violence, which is where the violence is not meant to communicate anything to anybody. It's just intended to do damage. And that might be as a tool so that the person doing it can get something else they want. The violence in a robbery, in a mugging is asocial. The point of it is you hurt a person so that you can get their stuff. Or this is violence perpetrated by people who take pleasure in hurting others. The violence is the whole point of the harming somebody else is something that this person wants to get out of it. The kind of archetypal example of asocial violence is serial killers because we like gory, sensationalistic things. But sometimes things like low-level sexual harassment can also be asocial violence, or at least asocial predatory behavior. So we've got play versus earnest, we've got social versus asocial, and then the last one, which I think in a lot of ways gets overlooked and is maybe one of the most important, is violence that is symmetrical or asymmetrical. Are you using the same weapons? Are you playing by the same rules? Are you constrained by the same social conventions? Do you have the same goals? Do you have the same outcomes? HEMA's actually a really interesting example of that, for example, our open tournaments, we kind of mix symmetrical and asymmetrical violence in a way that a lot of combat sports don't. And yes, I called it a sport, fight me. In that we make things very symmetrical in the sense that everybody's operating under the same rule set. We make things very symmetrical in that, generally speaking, people are fighting the same weapon. Mixed weapon tournaments exist, but they're an anomaly. Usually it's longsword versus longsword, rapier versus rapier, etc. People have the same goals, people have the same outcomes, people are kind of within the same social context, all of that stuff. But we allow for substantial physical asymmetries. And if you take a look at a HEMA Open tournament, you'll have a dude who's like 230 pounds and 6'4", and he might be fighting a woman who's 5'1" and weighs half of what he does soaking wet. So there's this really interesting mix of those two things that is something that we need to train for. And that doesn't show up in a lot of other play violence contexts because they usually try to take out as many asymmetries as possible. So there's a couple quick examples. That's one of the frameworks that I like to use. It's not the only one that's available, but I find that if you can kind of run through that mental checklist while you're looking at a particular scenario or a particular fight or what have you, it gives you a lot of insight into what kind of features you have to control for when you're training for it. Do you have to worry about rules? Do you have to worry about safety, and to what degree? Do you have to create external pressures like an audience that people are trying to impress, or judges that need to be communicated with? And do you have to prepare people both physically and psychologically for symmetrical scenarios where they're going to be pretty evenly matched with their opponent, or for asymmetrical ones where they might have a substantial advantage or a substantial disadvantage? And once we know all of those pieces, it's relatively easy to build training situations that adequately reflect what we actually want people to do, which is where I originally built this framework for. Yeah. I've talked a whole lot, and I know Charles has some different ideas for framing stuff, so I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, no, I love this framework because it's so abstract and portable. Like I can take this framework and I can think about 15th century Southern Germany, or I can think about 17th century Italy, and I have an abstract framework to take a set of circumstances and boil it down to components that I can use to form training scenarios. And also they form as kind of these salient reminders, like what should I keep my eyes open for, right? I think that the danger, like the reason I like this framework is that the danger that a lot of people have when thinking about violence is they look at the materials, like who has the weapon, right? Like, is this weapon, how long is it? Is it like 3 inches longer, or like, this one's got a choppier blade, so, well, this guy's got a helmet, and they think about like, oh, can this item penetrate another thing, right? And that's I think a very myopic view of violence. I mean, it's important, but I think it's perhaps overstressed by people who are only looking at the objects and thinking about the thing that's directly in their hand at that moment, right? That's like, this is all I have, this is all I know about, so that's all I'm going to pretend violence is. It's the tool in front of me. And it jives well with how I'm kind of approaching trying to build context. So I'm not really a modern self-defense instructor. So I think my general project in research has been to look for context for the martial art that I'm studying. For German Kunstwissenschaften, one of the problems we have is, what the heck are we doing? Like, we have the techniques and everything, right? And there's like some scribbling of like what we think it's for, but we don't have the vivid picture of who the people are that are practicing it. What are the contexts that they're practicing it in? What are their rules? What are they trying to demonstrate by practicing this? We don't know. And so a lot of my work has been thinking about trying to just add a little bit of color around what this world might have looked like. And in doing that, I think about a lot about the roles that people take on. So, so for example, I could be in a materially identical situation where, like, say I've got a spear and I'm fighting someone with a sword, just in this like materially identical situation, but the parameters change depending on whether I'm a man-at-arms, whether I am a levy soldier, whether I'm a town guard, right? That changes why we're fighting, what my objectives are. Or it could be that we have reached this situation through the course of a duel. Right. And in the duel, my opponent lost their spear, they drew their sword, and now we face off. I have a spear, he has a sword, right? And so what I like about the abstract framework is that it allows me to think about which are the components that are changing in each of these situations. And I think, like, for everyone else who's listening, because I got to remind myself that there are a lot of other people listening, you might not study, 15th century martial arts. You might be doing something else, but I think my advice is to think about the context which you're operating in, like what are the rules, and also learn about who's practicing your thing, right? I think that's it's important to know what their job is, and then how that job might actually be different from your current conception of what that job is. So, for example, a medieval soldier has a different set of responsibilities than a modern soldier, and like, if you're interested in exploring the context of your martial art, learn about what that involves. What are their thoughts about violence? What types of things are acceptable or unacceptable, and so that kind of really allows you to flesh in kind of the social versus asocial violence framework that you've been developing. So that's just a quick bit of advice, but that's also kind of the angle that I take. I try to figure out, like, okay, in the context of KDF, I'm thinking, who are these people? Who could they have been, right? Yeah. We're not sure. Like, we think they're probably knights or men-at-arms. And what does that mean? What are their thoughts on violence? When do they think it's acceptable to kill? And it turns out it doesn't really follow our modern ideas about when it's acceptable to kill someone, even in war, like in, fighting in the mud war, right? Like, there are situations where you don't kill someone because it's not cool.
Can I jump in real quick with some questions from the audience?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So somebody jumps in with this. If harm isn't inherent to violence, what is? what are the necessary conditions to call something violence?
Oh, that's deep.
We got a fucking philosophy student in the crowd.
And Eric follows on with a question about asocial violence that still has rules, with the example of kidnapping a noble for ransom and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you run with that.
Do you want to take a crack at it? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think we should both.
Yeah.
To be clear, I wasn't, like, when I'm talking about play violence, I'm not talking about stuff that does not do any harm whatsoever, but rather that we take steps to mitigate harm. I also, this is a distinction that I draw a lot when I'm teaching. There's a difference between hurt and harm. Violence, generally speaking, hurts. It makes our body go, ow. We have a physiological reaction that is, a thing has touched me and it is unpleasant, if we're talking about physical violence. And I'm going to sidebar things like emotional and sexual violence because I think they fall outside of the scope of the conversation that we're having. So physical violence, something has violated my physical boundaries. It has touched me in a way that I do not like. It is causing me hurt. Harm is the permanent damage that can occur from hurt. So bruises hurt, but they go away. And once a bruise has healed, there's no permanent impairment to a human. Broken bones are harm. Torn ligaments are harm. Concussions and brain injuries are harm. Anything that will have some kind of a long-term effect on our life is harm. And we can argue that, like, even a minor cut, because it leaves a scar afterwards, and that scar tissue is somehow going to change the functioning of our body, is harm, and that's fine. So I guess for me, violence is about a violation of personal boundaries. It always hurts to some degree, and it may or may not do harm, depending on its parameters and the circumstances under which it happens. Charles can disagree with me if he so desires.
Oh, no, I like that. I have another way to look at it that I've been thinking about it. So I have this project. I won't talk too long about it, but it's basically medieval tactical. But it's basically trying to explore the idea of, military garments of the period. Military garments of the period, but then also civilian garments that try to appear like military garments. And the idea of civilian fashion mimicking military dress. Just most people should know tactical in the modern context. But I think that the deep idea that I'm trying to access is the idea that anytime we have an element of I don't want to use the word violence anymore because it's now loaded, but like physical harm, like physical damage, right? Yeah. Anytime we have situations of physical damage or the expressions of capacity to inflict physical damage, we get stuff that appears around it that isn't quite the actual infliction of damage. It is, I want to threaten you with physical damage. I want to appear like someone who is capable of inflicting physical damage. I want to show that I will not inflict physical damage when I'm able to. So the idea is that, like, whether I appear like I could cut your head off in one stroke, right? And that's like just very violent, super violent. But there is a constellation of behaviors that it generates that is not exactly the actual component of harm, but is certainly related to it. And so, I haven't thought this through, but like I would say that we could think of violence as being somehow related to the constellation of behaviors that are generated by the actual physical act of harm. So an example is, I could cut your head off, but I threaten you, right? I put my hand on my sword, right? And that is, we might not call that a violent situation, but it is definitely relevant to the acts, the martial arts that we are training, and it's certainly related to like the core idea of the use of physical harm, the threat of
Mhm.
physical harm, or the absence of it, right? Like I could, you know, in many duels in the 18th century. Sorry, I'm on like a Hamilton binge, but like, you know, the the idea is that you could have shot your opponent, but you just decide to shoot in the air, and that is designed to be a social signal of your willingness to not inflict harm. And so that duel, even if ex post both people fire in the air, it is definitely, I would consider that a violent situation because of the possibility of harm and the signals that it sends about ourselves, because we're playing off of the idea that we could have physically harmed each other.
Mhm. I really love this
That's
idea
Mhm.
of there being a whole kind of like language and paradigm of violence around the act itself. And I think that's something that we end up talking about a lot in self-defense instruction, which I realized I totally ignored in my introduction. I also teach modern self-defense. It's sort of
We will
relevant.
get back to that.
Yeah, we will probably.
Yeah.
We'll get back to that 5 years I spent punching cops for a living, and everything that
Yes.
came out of that. So yeah, I think it's definitely stuff that falls within the purview of those of us that study violence. And that kind of comes back for me to that myopia that you were talking about earlier, where people get hyper focused on like not just the weapons in their hands, but that moment when those weapons actually interact. And that takes
Yeah.
away some of the most interesting and juicy parts, which is okay, but what's all the stuff that happens beforehand? Like how did we arrive at this situation where two people are hitting each other with swords? Because that shit did not happen out of the blue. It did not happen in a vacuum. It's not,
Yeah.
you know, one of the most like interesting abstractions of HEMA as a martial arts practice and as a sport is that we just stick two people in a ring and are like, cool, you're going to hit each other now. You know,
Yeah.
like we talk about the degree to which points are an abstraction. We talk about the degree to which armor and bloods are an abstraction. But the biggest fucking abstraction is that we stripped away all of the social context, all of the language, all of the communication, all of the lead up that happens before the fight itself, and just went, okay, we're only concerned with this one little element. And that's fine. That's the thing that we're totally allowed to do. But it gets weird when we then try to connect that practice of just the moment of the fight to our broader understanding of historical violence, to our broader understanding of historical combat. Whether we're talking about like military combat, because there's so much stuff that happens in a battle before people start hitting each other with weapons.
Oh yeah.
To the idea of dueling. Like we know historically that so many duels, you know, we have the thing that Charles brought up with people shooting in the air, but we also know like there's a lot of duels that just don't happen. You know, people show up and they're like, well, cool, we both proved that we've got the balls to do this. Let's go home. Fuck that. You know? And that was still a fight.
Yeah.
First blood duels are a thing. Duels to the death are a thing. Like there's so much stuff around it. And if we really want to understand the world that the people whose texts we're reading were living in, the world that they were preparing for, the kind of violence that was a part of their lives, we really need to look at that entire spectrum of violence, the way that Charles brought it up, that whole kind of behavior and communication and all of the stuff that happens before we actually get to that moment of physical conflict. So yeah, I love that.
I would like to jump in again with questions from the audience.
Please.
Jess Finley posted an interesting thing, basically talking about the bar fight that's okay until it's not. And then the audience jumps in to break it up because it's no longer fair.
Yep.
Which is fascinating. And it ties in, I think, with what you just said about duels.
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the deals with bringing a second to a duel as well, right? Like bar fights are an informal dueling structure, but that's effectively what they are. Formal duels are kind of the same thing. You bring somebody along, not only there to back you up, but also to stop things if they go too far. And this is one of the interesting things that happens, is that even earnest violence, even violence that could very well get people killed has limits, and those limits are generally social rather than physiological or tactical. And dueling and bar fighting is a really great example of that, where a lot of the times the things that constrain it, the things that end a fight or don't, are things that have nothing to do with the physical capacity of the people involved to continue doing harm. Either they internally decide, okay, yeah, cool, we proved our point, we fulfilled our social goal here, great, I'm going to go home and lick my wounds and die of sepsis. Or somebody external to it decides that, all right, Joe, you've proved your point, your hockey team is indeed better than his hockey team, let's go the fuck home, your wife's waiting, kind of thing. Because that's our modern dueling context, right? Is my sports team is better than your sports team, let's punch each other outside a pub. That's like, I'm sorry, modern dudes, if you want some really, really cool dueling, Minster Infectin is fascist and gross. You have to get in bar fights instead.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Two situations kind of pop up to me. The first one is, well, I guess the broader context is that for some reason, men, usually men, actually almost predominantly men, have this idea of this no holds barred violence that is, you know, perhaps a consequence of kind of the HEMA, what I call a petri dish fight, which is like, you know, who would win? The guy,
Right,
like
yeah.
one guy with the long, you know, okay. But it's a like, we can imagine these two fighters, petri dish, we put them in there, they fight it out like Pokemon, and they have no rules, or, you know, whatever rules we endow them with. You know, the counterexamples I give is, you know, in medieval combat, just say knightly combat, ransom is a thing. The idea is that guy is worth a lot
It's
alive.
lucrative.
It's very rich, and not only that, he knows if he surrenders, we will treat him well. You know, that we'll, you know, yeah, we'll tie him up and everything, but, you know, that guy will live, and, you know, we'll put him in the guest bedroom, and on his honor, he's not going to try to escape. And once the brokers deal out the cash, he's free to go home. So the idea is that, you know, there are limits to violence. And the other example I like to use, which I'm reading right now, to further explore, is looking at gang violence in the modern day. I'm reading this book called Gang Leader for a Day, where they explore drug gangs in the south side of Chicago. And there's this really cool anecdote of these two gang members, opposing gangs. They got in some squabble over like a girl, and one of them ended up knifing the other. Okay, and he survived, but the leader of the local Boys and Girls Club said, hey, you know, like, this needs to end now. We're gonna settle this fight. You two meet out back in the Boys and Girls Club. You're gonna fist fight, right? And you're gonna get it all out right now. And, you know, I love that example, because it is both an act of violence, but also the act is a mitigation of violence, right? Because they knew that the context was, what's next is a shooting. What's next is a drive-by shooting, and then we get a gang war, right? Like that is the continuation of that they see, right? And so community leaders intervened, and they said, okay, well, we need a fair or symmetric-ish situation, something that sends social signals about where violence is appropriate, and we're going to put it here in a way to mitigate violence. So the idea of an act of violence to mitigate violence is really cool, but it's also a situation where you have mitigation of violence in situations where most people would think that there are no rules, right? Like a gang war. The middle of a gang war, right? You know, like the police won't go there. They are forming rules, they're forming norms unilaterally to mitigate violence. And if you can find it there, that should hopefully impress on someone who's not fully convinced by a bunch of like nerd book anecdote shit, you know, like, hey, these gang members have figured it out, right? Like, gang wars are costly, so you better like tamp that stuff down, right? That's actually my working analogy for, you know, feudalism, just kind of like an organized crime with some basic like social services thrown in.
God, that's a really good analogy.
Yeah,
It
I'll post
really
the book.
is.
Yeah.
And and I'm thinking about, and it's been a while since I've looked at these, so I'm probably going to get details wrong. But when I was, because my educational background is medieval literature, and back when I was doing my undergrad, at one point I was looking at 13th century, I think, Germany, and a particular translation of an Arthurian poem called Yvain. And it's originally in French. It's one of the poems that Chrétien de Troyes writes in the 12th century. We get a German version by Hartmann von Au in, I think, the 13th or the 14th century. I'm really fuzzy on dates. And then we get a Middle English version that shows up in like the 15th century. So we've got these three translations, and they're wildly divergent from one another in terms of length and content. Like the German one is like 1,000 lines longer, because of course it is, and the English one is like 500 lines shorter than the French. And the stuff that they add is really relevant to the cultural context that's happening. And one of the things that happens in the German one is it gets like really het up about the rules of violence. It has, anytime there's a fight scene or there's a duel, which there is all the time in Arthurian literature, because it's just knights riding around on horses killing each other to impress girls, or God, or both. There are so many duels in Yvain, and the German ones are like, okay, these were the rules around the duel, and we know that this guy was a bad guy because these are all of the rules that he broke. And working on this as an undergrad, I was like, this was like 12 or 13 years ago. This was the first time I kind of started looking at historical contexts for violence and looking at, okay, well, what the fuck was going on in Germany at the time that they needed all of these rules? And you're like, oh, everybody was dueling. And they kept wrecking things. And you end up with these increasingly elaborate rule sets that are things like, okay, so if you're pursuing your quarry, you're chasing him down on your fucking horse, and you want to fight him, if he hides behind a piece of agricultural equipment, you have to let him go. Because and there's a lot of stuff like that is like extremely clearly aimed at limiting collateral damage to the people whose work actually makes the country run.
Yeah.
And it is the equivalent of, like, in the middle of a gang war, you don't shoot up the restaurants and the grocery stores because people need to eat.
Yeah.
And it was the same thing. We're like, okay, knightly dueling culture is a stupid thing. There's too many like 5th and 6th born sons running around. They're going to fight each other. This is how it works. It's terrible, but it keeps happening.
Yeah.
We need to do something to corral them so that they don't fuck up everything else.
Yeah.
And so you get these rules that are not don't duel, because nobody's going to do that. And you need that violence as a certain kind of cultural safety valve. And that's a thing that I know Charles has been interested in recently as well, with how you've been playing Crusader Kings, among other things.
Yes, that's right.
Oh yeah, I'm going to bring that in.
God.
But yeah, violence has a cost, and the cost is not just person A and person B fought each other and person B is dead now, or person B is hurt now. But collateral damage is a thing that exists. When you kill somebody in a sufficiently high position of power vacuums exist, and that can lead to more unrest and more violence, which has really big social costs. You can destabilize, an entire community by killing the wrong guy. You can do a lot of damage by injuring a couple of people, because then they require care and there's a resource cost involved in that. So this is a thing that we come back to again and again and again, even around the big, scary, brutal violence, where everybody around it is very aware of what it costs, and there are always measures in place to mitigate that. And often the biggest censure and the biggest like social pressure and the biggest like ostracism and policing and so on is against people who violate those rules, is against people who do violence wrong. Who break the limits that have been socially placed on violence and make it too expensive for everybody. because you don't ever, even in a relatively, we talk about how modern Western culture is afraid of violence and we don't do violence and all of that stuff. And it's one of the big narratives when we, among people who teach martial arts and self-defense and so on. So yeah, we have lots of violence. It's just that we have put it in really neat and tidy boxes. We have martial arts, we have combat sports, we have state violence, we have police officers and we have members of the military and so on. We have people who are literally legally authorized to do the violence. And then we have lots of people who aren't, who by the rules that we have put around violence in our culture are not allowed to do it, or are allowed to do it only under very specific extenuating circumstances. And just because the boxes that medieval people or early modern people put violence into look different from the ones that we have doesn't mean that those boxes don't exist. And I think that's one of the big kind of gaps that often happens when modern people look back on an earlier period and go, oh, the average human had more access to violence, therefore there were no rules and it was everywhere. And you're like,
Yeah,
no. And also I don't even think that was true.
I think actually I put this in the notes that I sent it. But basically, I want to present like a cartoon, like a caricature of like a self-defense view, which is that, in the modern self-defense kind of atmosphere, there's this idea of like I'm going to draw a line, whatever this line is, it's an abstract. But if you cross that line, I can do whatever I want to you. Just guns out, just start blasting, like once you cross that line right there, right? You cross that line, just start blasting, right? And I see, like, it's never explicitly stated because it just like when I say it, it sounds crazy. But the idea is the use of force as this binary choice in self-defense, and so you see it in the way self-defense with guns is taught, right? You draw and immediately just like don't shoot if you like, don't draw if you're not going to shoot, like there's a set of rules that leads you to a very brittle nature. And so I present this not as what I think what is good modern self-defense, but rather the paradigm that a lot of people operate under, right? Especially as modern civilians, people who don't have access to this violence and probably maybe they're not even directly taking a self-defense class, but they're kind of just lurking on the edges of a self-defense or firearms community, and that becomes their understanding of what violence is in their particular situation, right? And and so this is designed as a segue because I want to know how your training with the Vancouver Police Department, how they think about it, and basically try to like your thoughts on this. Like, I'm sure you know that this is kind of like a thing, that there's this notion of very brittle self-defense that I think we're projecting onto history because we think that is kind of this universal structure of violence. I don't know, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love where you're going with that. And actually the first thing that I thought of was a meme that has been making its way around HEMA groups in Facebook over like the last week. And it's burglar breaks into house, and then HEMA guy, and it's somebody like, and it's supposed to be funny, but it's that same idea that, oh, somebody came into your home, take out your swords and fucking murder that guy. This is your chance. This is your opportunity to live out all of your violent fantasies. And there's something really fucking disturbing. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And I see that going around shared as a lighthearted thing, and I'm like, guys, we need to talk.
Like I just want to say, like, explain to me why this is funny. Yes. Go on. Explain.
I get to do a murder. Is what you're communicating via this.
Yeah.
Charles brought up my exciting employment background. So I will talk a little bit about that now. For 5 years, I ended this job this summer. I worked for the Force Options Training Unit of the police department in my city. And I worked as a role player. That was my official job title. It's great. And my job was to participate in physical skills training and in realistic training scenarios, as a training partner if we were working things like judo throws or control positions or handcuffing, that kind of thing. Or more frequently, we would build very realistic scenarios that were like examples of things that officers might expect to encounter on the job. And all of the actors in those would be role players. So we might be a victim who needs help. We might be a subject who is having a mental health breakdown or is doing really horrible things and needs to be stopped. We might be a bystander. We might be a fellow police officer, especially if one is injured or panics or otherwise has to do their job badly. They don't like using real cops for that. And the majority of what we were training officers on in those scenarios was not how to physically do stuff. They would go learn somewhere else how to fire a gun. They would learn somewhere else how to use a taser, or they might do it with us in the gym on a different day. But in scenarios, what we were working on was decision making. And specifically, a lot of what we were drilling them on was decision making around appropriate use of force. And around moving away from that binary idea of you do no violence until you do all the violence. And I really like the way that Charles framed that, because I do think that that's how people think a lot of the time. And grading that and breaking it down into a spectrum and going, no, the violence is an incremental thing, and you only get to do the amount of violence that is appropriate to the situation that you're dealing with. In Canada, we're very lucky in some ways, in that we have a lot more centralization around how some of these things are regulated. So for example, in Canada, we have a national use of force framework, which is a breakdown of this is the level of violence that is acceptable to use in these situations. That is the guideline for every single police force in the country. And it's not a law, but it is related to how the laws work around violence. And it is a way of thinking about violence that all of the courts are familiar with and that everybody gets trained on. So internally within policing and within the Canadian judicial system, there's like a shared understanding of these gradations of violence. So for example, if somebody is actively resisting being arrested or resisting being somehow physically controlled, an officer is allowed to use some physical force on them. They might, in some circumstances, be allowed to use something like a baton, depending. But they can't tase them. They can't take out a gun and shoot them. That's a nope. If somebody is in the process of physically harming somebody else, then an escalation is allowed, and now we're allowed to tase them. You know, the situations in which it is appropriate to pepper spray somebody are not the same as the situations in which it is appropriate to shoot them, are not the same as the situations in which it is appropriate to talk to them. And we would routinely, in the scenarios we built, we would test officers' ability to make the right decision. We would present them with a situation that was happening, and it might change very quickly and escalate really fast and be very distressing. And what we were looking for was, did they make the right choice? Did they choose the right implement to use? Did they use the right degree of violence? And they were always allowed to use less. And I've done scenarios where, you know, I was coming after somebody with a knife. I wasn't in the middle of attacking them yet, but I had one and I was upset and I was coming towards them and there was an imminent threat. And we'd run the same scenario with like 20 officers, and some of them would tase me, which was reasonable. And some of them would get the knife out of my hand one way or another and take me to the ground, which was again reasonable. And there were a couple that just talked me right down. And in one case, I remember I ended up sitting down on a couch next to an officer without my knife, and she didn't even cuff me because I'd gotten de-escalated so thoroughly. And that kind of gradation is something that I think is hugely valuable, and it's something that I try to bring into my self-defense teaching. Because that binary problem of self-defense that Charles brings up, not only does it like completely fuck up our understanding of how violence is actually supposed to work, but it also leaves people missing the tools that are the most useful to them. And this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about self-defense and then kind of feed it back into HEMA, is I run into this a lot in women's self-defense, specifically, that women get taught two things in a lot of self-defense courses, which I'm going to argue are terrible self-defense courses, but they're the bulk of what's out there, which is you either get taught to say no and set a firm boundary and use your words, or you get taught how to choke a guy out, break his balls, and otherwise like physically debilitate a human being, if not kill them. It's you know, talk to them nicely or Krav Maga. And it's that same binary ideal at play, that you're going to try to do the non-violent thing until it is time to violence, and when it is time to violence, you will do all of the violence. And that completely disregards how the world actually works, both on a social level. You know, there was a video going around a while back that a BJJ school put out that was supposed to advertise fantastic women's self-defense, and it made me want to punch things, where a man and a woman are sitting next to each other in a bar. And the dude gets creepy. He leans in too close to the woman. He touches the small of her back. He's being a problem. He has clearly violated her physical boundaries. We can talk about that being violence as well. And her response is she grabs the collar of his suit jacket like it's a judo gi, and she strangles him unconscious. And it's like, it's technically beautifully done. And you know, and this guy slumps on the bar. And then the woman like leans back again and starts enjoying her drink. And you're like, okay, that was sexy and beautifully done, but like, let's put this in its context. A of all, who's just going to sit there and let somebody get choked out in the middle of a public bar? B of all, what's going to happen to that woman afterwards? Because she definitely just committed a crime. And given how, you know, socially we tend to deal with sexual violence, people might be a lot more forgiving of what the guy was doing, but they're definitely going to see what she did as a fucking problem because there is an unconscious man. And third of all, okay, cool. When you strangle somebody like that, they bounce back in like 5 to 15 seconds. Do you think maybe he's going to be mad when he wakes back up again? Then what? She's just dramatically escalated the situation. And if he decides to punch her in the face over it, he might be seen as justified. So we end up decontextualizing violence and only giving people these tools that, if they don't take somebody out of the fight outright, will escalate it to a level where it's super, super dangerous for everybody involved and might make the situation way worse. And when they're faced with a lower level of violence where something more measured might be an appropriate response, they don't have any options, you know? If there's a guy sitting next to me in the bar and he's touching me inappropriately, he's being a creep, and I try saying no and it doesn't work, and the only other thing I know how to do is choke him unconscious, it's really unlikely that I'm going to be able to like bring myself to actually do that. So I have to just sit there and take it and keep trying to say no because I literally don't have other tools. And I feel like that's something that shows up in HEMA as well, where there tends to be a focus on the what I tend to call smashy murder time techniques. The stuff that is extremely destructive, the stuff that has extremely serious consequences. And it removes an entire spectrum of things that are very much a part of the art and are critical to understanding how people engaged with violence and how people did violence in period. Charles, what do you say to that? That was a long ramble.
I can only address a small subset of that because all of it is fascinating. I've been thinking about it from I don't want to say the opposite perspective because that puts me in the shoes of like the creepers, but really think about it as a bully,
Yeah.
like how bullies approach norms for violence, right? Usually we think about it in a self-defense context. Here are the lines I set, and you cross these lines, here's the level of force I use. And I've been thinking about how bullies interact with violence and what it, like if I know what your norms are, right, I can push those boundaries, right? And you know, in kind of a sexual harassment situation, that's a similar thing. There are norms for behavior. I'm going to toe that edge, see what your response is, and then push further and closer, right? And the idea is that I'm working on this idea of calling it like social terrain, which is that the terrain in which you're fighting, the physical terrain is important, but there's also social terrain, in which the sense that I know I can occupy this position because my norms will let me get there, right? So if it's someone and you know it's a bar, I can probably get within handshake distance of that person, right? That is as important as a physical barrier between us or the lack of one. And what that does is it allows me to get close, and I can actually push the barrier, right? I can actually push that boundary to determine what your actual response is. And the idea is that bullies can actually get a lot closer than would be tactically sound in kind of a petri dish environment. I've run a few experiments kind of in quick draw scenarios and like bar fights-ish scenarios where people are able to get within wrestling distance. And, you know, that fancy longsword you have that, you know, is the ideal length for an engagement and a duel, you know, and can kill any one-on-one fight. You can't even draw it, right? Like, and the idea is that you know, I need to greet someone. Someone is going to approach me unarmed, right? Or like they haven't drawn their weapon yet. What am I supposed to do? Do I draw? That means I drew first, and that socially means something about my willingness to start a fight. So having to make that decision as someone is getting very close to you, like they could even be visibly angry and hostile. But they're getting close to you and they've actually entered your space, right? Which is as important as the inability to get close to someone because of a hallway or some physical feature. That began to make me think about what the importance of a broad skill set was. Most people who study KDF do longsword, and they only do longsword, Blossfechten longsword, and that, you know, in kind of my generation, kind of post Wichtenauer, it's mostly been a single weapon. Like most people, they enter and they stick with the single weapon for a while. But looking at that scenario and thinking about the context of the types of engagements people might be having, it is consistent with what we see in manuscripts. Here's a huge set of tools, right? Not just long swords, right? But like you've got armor, you got daggers, and you've got how to smash a dude with the ground, right? And not start like blood feuds. And so that has gotten me thinking, okay, there is this notion of a continuum of force, of tools to deal with different physical situations and social situations. And I think ringing is actually the most broadly applicable. Like, you know, I don't get to train it as much as I do, but I have mad respect for it. And I think people, if they're thinking about how to practice the martial art in a historically contextually honest way, they would think about ringing as a de-escalation tool, or as that midpoint in a continuum of force. It's not drawing a sword and hitting them with the flat. It's dealing with a lot of the situations before a sword is drawn. You know, maybe someone gets in a lock, they're thrown to the ground, but nobody dies. No one has to draw a sword. And so my opinion is, like, I think that those experiments, which I ran about 2 years ago, made me start thinking more broadly about the study of the art as a whole. Like, what are the other tools that are being given to you by the author of the source that you are studying, rather than what tournaments are there tomorrow and which one are you going to start, you know, like, I think the focus of a lot of people who practice is, what's the next tournament? What weapons does it have? All right, I train that one. Yeah. Done. Like that's literally it. And that forms the content, when they project their notions of self-defense, then it becomes like, either it's we are friends and we're shaking hands, or I draw my sword and I kill you. Like that, it forms that binary notion of violence because they don't have any modern handles for wrestling or what would at the time could have been ways to de-escalate.
I love everything you're saying, and I'm also thinking about the really interesting emotional response I just had to you talking about wrestling as de-escalation.
Yeah.
Because, like, you're right in so many ways. Thinking about all of the disarms and the non-lethal stuff that shows up in Messer, for example. It's all grappling based.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. My reaction was weird because I'm thinking about the sources that I work from, specifically Marazzo, who doesn't teach wrestling as a separate thing, but it shows up as a component of other stuff. And often the wrestling is the nasty bit.
Yep.
It's almost the opposite. When you're playing with swords, and this is where shifts in historical context get really, really important. We often talk about HEMA like it's this like one thing that varies by weapon.
Yeah.
And Charles and I, in terms of the periods that we're working on, are 150 to 200 years apart, something like that. And we're dealing with wildly different contexts. And when Marazzo's talking about teaching in his book, because there's a lot that he discusses about pedagogy, date on that is the 1530s for folks that need context. 1530s Italy. I should be specific. 1530s Bologna.
We're actually not that far off then.
Yeah, look at it.
Yeah, I'm like mid 15.
Okay,
yeah.
So it's even closer.
Yeah. But it's I agree though. It is
wildly different
for
because
sure. Yeah.
He's talking about running something that looks like a commercial school, and when you look at his students, these are not men-at-arms. This is definitely not people who are being sent off to war. And he's actually got a lot of sections that are that feel really interestingly modern. Like there's a chunk, I was looking at this earlier today. This is in the prologue to the third assault for the Sword and Buckler. That's chapter 12, I think, in the Swanger translation, where he's talking about how to keep your students interested. And how okay, you have, I know that you want to show them the strata plays first because that's the good shit, but you can't. Because if you show them that first and then later you try to teach them the Larga stuff, they're going to think it's boring and they're going to lose interest and they're not going to want to do it. So here's how you structure your lessons in order to keep your fickle fucking students engaged. And he has another bit, again, where he's talking about the distinction between gioco largo or the wide play, which is all swords. And it's big full cuts and it's beautiful and it's swishy and it's dually, and yeah, you could murder somebody that way, but it's just sword on sword. Or gioco stretto, the close play, which is where we get grabby and wrestly and kicky and punchy and head smashy. I think one of the first stretto plays that he shows in the entire book, the transition to stretto happens by swinging your foot up and kicking somebody in the junk. This is not the nice stuff. And he talks about how you're going to have students that don't really have the stomach for that. There are going to be people who come to you to train and they're not going to have a good heart to do the wrestly stuff because it's mean. So just teach them this other earlier stuff. Teach them the first and second assault. It's pretty and it's swishy and it'll make them feel really cool. And they'll get to perform that social masculinity dance of violence that Charles was bringing up earlier. And they don't have to do any of the scary shit that, oh, by the way, is actually the core of the art. So in one of the main source that I study, wrestling is not the nice stuff. It's not the de-escalation. It's how you actually end the fight. And it also shows up in the one section of the test that is explicitly self-defense, which is his defenses against the dagger. And it's you're unarmed and somebody's trying to stab you. And all of the grappling in that ends in either throws that are very likely to break somebody's neck or cause a traumatic brain injury. Or if you're being nice, disarms that involve breaking joints.
Interesting.
And that kind of, I think, segues into something, Charles, that you brought up when we were chatting before we started this session, when we were exchanging notes, where that modern idea that things like joint locks and
yes,
are particularly brutal. And they're the things that we, you know, when we show them as modern practitioners, and we're like, yeah, no, and you know, this is how you totally break somebody's elbow, and everybody goes, ooh, it's the scary stuff, and you're like, okay, but 10 minutes ago I was showing you how to stab somebody through the eyeball. And there's an interesting disconnect that happens in modern practice around brutality and wrestling that I think is kind of at play in my reaction as well.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I didn't expect that. I didn't know that there was that kind of relationship going on in Marazzo. For KDF, what's interesting is that the individual subcomponents are generally written by separate authors, so you never get this coherent view of like, you do this in this situation, and we think this is especially brutal or less brutal, or and so all that's left is for us to project what we think is brutal and what is not, right? That's all we have. And it's funny that it's actually by Marazzo's time, when he's teaching students, that is the reaction they have, because it's what we have today. That our protective equipment, and perhaps in Marazzo's time, the norms for force in their practice switched around what was useful, or what the way that the brutality was experienced, and it changed things. If my context is Italian fencing school, 16th century, that changes how I view certain techniques. I'm just reminded again, back to gangs, Chicago gangs. You know, the gang bosses, there's this really great account of them saying like, hey, we look for shorties. Like, shorties are like the foot soldiers. Like, we're looking for good shorties, and they need to know when to use force and when not to use force. And if they can keep a cool head and deal out punishment as necessary, which involved beatings, sometimes they'll injure people, but if they don't go too far, that is a valuable quality in a henchman, and these are people we're going to promote. And like in my project of just basically importing that mindset into the feudal period, like, I've got my retainers, I got my men-at-arms, I need them to extract money from people. Like, I need to know that they have tools, right? That they have physical tools, but also that they are skilled enough to know when to use certain types of violence, and when it's longsword time, or when it's time to go nuts. And someone who can only kill people is like, really, you're gonna push him out.
No, that guy is a liability. Nobody wants that guy.
Nobody wants that guy. And you would actually actively punish them, like publicly punish them, to show like, this is not what we do, right? This is not what our organization is about. Internally, and also to the public, you punish that person to show like, this is not what our organization, which is how they refer to the gang, is about. And then also to the public, that like, we are not just about killing people. We also, in addition to the drug trade, we're also providing social services, justice, kind of keeping the peace in the absence of police. But yeah, so my thinking is that the norms that our beliefs about the brutality of the types of violence we have are probably formed more unconsciously by the way we practice them, rather than what we read or what we know about the historical contexts. And so techniques which are have the higher potential for injury in their actual practice, we would conflate with being more brutal historically. And certainly I think movies play up on that, where I'm imagining I don't know, just like
have a really long conversation with Foley artists on medieval films.
Oh yeah.
And the responsibility that they bear for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Can I jump in again real quick there?
Do it.
Yeah.
All right, a couple of things, and then I have a great segue. Great conversation is happening in chat. except when they got into puns. I am failing.
Share the puns.
They'll be there.
I want
I'm
the puns.
failing. I'm falling behind on questions, and it is now 8:20, and I think we've probably got 10 or 30 minutes left. So keep that in mind.
Yeah.
I'm going to just jump into the latest question, which I think is really good. Both. Could you speak to what seems to be, to me, a casual disregard for knocking someone out unconscious? A KO is cheered, but breaking an arm is frowned on. Breaking a jaw is uncool, but the same punch can give brain damage. Is this a media thing, or is there more behind it in your view?
Could I have my pithy asshole statement first?
Please.
I blame superhero movies. Like how much of like Batman or Daredevil going on and on and on and on about how they don't kill, and then giving people like 80 traumatic brain injuries in a single episode have we seen? Like there is a thing in popular media, absolutely, that if you want to disable a human but not kill them because killing is bad, the safest and kindest way to do that is by knocking them unconscious, usually by applying blunt force trauma to their head. And that's not the case. like biologically, that's bad. And I think when we look at the historical material, there's an awareness of that, absolutely. Like again, I can't speak to Charles's sources because I just don't know them that well. But certainly, when you're looking at Marazzo, when you aim anything at another person's head, it's because you want to fuck them up. And the throws, for example, and the takedowns that are very clearly designed to knock somebody unconscious and probably like compress their C-spine, are a response to somebody trying to murder you and you having no other choice. Like they are very, very high on that use of force spectrum. They are a high level of dangerous force. And I feel like that's a connection that we've kind of lost in modern thinking. And maybe that is because people don't interact with violence as much on a daily basis. Like I said, the average human does not have much license to do violence and to interact with it on an ongoing basis. So we have to look at media, and media tells us that knocking somebody unconscious is better than murdering them. And if Batman does it and Batman doesn't kill, then it's fine. And it's something that we allow to happen in our sports. You know, people get knocked out in MMA, people get knocked out in boxing, and they come back. And, you know, yeah, sure, by the end of his career, Muhammad Ali's hands were shaking like this, and he had so many traumatic brain injuries that he could not function as a human anymore, but he wasn't dead, so it was fine. I think our sense of that is really skewed. And it's definitely one of my personal bugbears, because I think that the HEMA community as a whole dramatically underestimates the risk of traumatic brain injuries and lets them happen way too much in our sport. But that is a hell of a tangent, and I'm going to let Charles speak.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think so I guess within KDF, there's not actually that much striking to the head or striking general. I think there are a few strikes, but it's pretty clear if you're unarmed, your objective is to hit them with the earth, right? Or to lock them. And, you know, one can speculate as to why, but I think it's certainly consistent with the view that, you know, maybe they did understand what damage to the head did, and whether that was consistent with kind of the norms that they had at the time. I think the second thing, though, is that, you know, just because a norm, even if a norm was historic, it doesn't mean we need to adopt it in our training environment, right? Which is, I think, a point that I wanted to make.
Yes.
But you know, suppose we found out, like, yeah, the dudes just clocked each other. They didn't know about, you know, traumatic brain injuries or anything like that. And, you know, maybe they had a very high tolerance for injury in the practice of their sport, or whatever you want to call it. right? Whatever the thing they thought they were doing, whether it was like some kind of dance or ritualized violence or it was a duel, but maybe they had a higher tolerance for broken bones and brain injury. That doesn't necessarily need to be our norms, right? And so, so we as kind of people who are developing the practice of HEMA, like I want to push that HEMA is not like we've got our gear and we're done, right? We got our tournaments and like let's just ride this out until we are all come home with medals. Instead, it's this iterative process where we're thinking about how do we practice this art in one that's consistent with our values first, but then also what we know about the context of the time. So the idea is, yeah, nowadays TBI is not a thing that we are going to accept, or within my community or within whatever larger environment I'm operating in. These are our norms. We know that there are historic norms. Let's keep them separate, but we should still think about how we can incorporate that and how that reflects on our practice. I think the danger is the danger in this kind of like pseudo-historical justification is to project our norms for violence to the past and then see it reflected back into the current. So an example would be, I think historic violence was very brutal and there were no norms. That's the projection into the past. And then when someone complains about norms in practice, they say, well, historically there were no norms. We're just practicing the art as it was, right? And so that looking into the past and seeing exactly what you wanted to see is that entire exercise is problematic, right? But in both directions. First one, when I project my own views or my own biases, and then the second one is when I am unable to separate my views of historical violence and treat it as something that's distinct from the norms and values I have today.
That's such a good point, and it's super well stated. And I think the only thing that I want to add to emphasize it, because I feel like maybe we should get to more of these questions,
that's right, yeah.
is that HEMA as an art, as a practice, is so new. Like this is, we are practicing a little baby art that is like maybe now possibly entering its preteen years in terms of the development of a thing. And it's one of the best parts of what we're doing, in that as practitioners, we're shaping what HEMA is and what it means and how we practice it. And I really love that Charles has like made a point of saying that that's integral to doing HEMA. And I really want to emphasize that it's a practice of curation, that we are constantly choosing what we're going to emulate, what we're going to replicate, and what we're not. Because we do operate in a different cultural context than the one that we're training for. And also because our lives are fundamentally different from those of the people that we're seeking to emulate. Even if I'm looking at somebody like Marasso, who was running a martial arts school, and like, hey, I run a martial arts school, and his students were wanting to learn swords because it made them look cool, and some of my students want to learn swords that make them want to look cool. Great. But like, my students have day jobs, and they need to be able to use their hands and their brains at those. And they need to be able to earn an income. And there are all of these limitations, they have childcare obligations, which I guarantee none of Marazzo's students did. There are all of these practical limitations on how we practice in the modern period that require that we curate, that require that we choose what we're going to do, what we're going to be really, really pedantic and accurate about, and what we're going to fudge or what we're going to modify in order to fit the context that we actually function. And that's super fucking important. Sorry, Facebook Live, I swear all the time. I just realized that might not be optimal.
Yeah.
So yeah,
completely agree, yeah.
Why don't we get folks to throw some questions at us for a bit, just rapid fire,
Yeah.
and then if you guys can give us like a 5-minute warning to wrap up, and we'll do some nice closing statements, and that'll be that.
Yeah.
All
If
right.
our volunteers have to bail early, I'm down to stay till like 9:30, and I can keep running things.
We're good. It's COVID. We're not going anywhere.
I'm gonna say let's call it at 9.
Your panel.
Because I have like neurological limitations on how long I can stare at a screen and talk to 50 people I can't see. Um, but I'm happy to stay till then.
I'm going to take the last question on the list. Jess says, I was once speaking to a friend about my art and mentioned Mordschlag, which apparently means murder stroke. I don't know how to pronounce that. And the friend literally recoiled and gave me a lecture about how awful being a murderer is, and you should know better of what we speak. Question, do you guys think we should acknowledge these things, or is there a benefit to keeping HEMA a game? Right? Like, sort of, how do we go about communicating our sports, our study, our passion, whatever it is, to the outside world? An outside world that might not like things like murder strokes.
I've got stuff. I guess, I don't know. All right, so I guess I can speak a little bit about that. I guess Mordschlag, I've got a bunch of questions about the actual name, right? Because if Mordschlag is the murder stroke, then what the heck is all the other stuff that we're doing? Right? Right? Like, this is the one where you murder
Yeah,
them,
this is
right?
the one that kills the guy. Only this.
Yeah.
All that other stabbing, it's fine.
But I mean, that might actually point to a lot of the, it might actually point to what the purpose of what we're doing is, like, or open questions about it. I think the way I think of it, at least for the presentation, the public facing content that people are allowed to see is, I think it's curated depending on how deep they go, right, and their level of comfort with it. So if someone wants to engage kind of on a day, like I might think of as a day one level, which is like, yeah, we're fighting with swords, isn't it cool, throwing your like Game of Thrones reference or some shit like that. It's just stuff that I don't particularly care about, but I know engages with the public in a more like palatable way. And like that, you get these gradations where, like, as you become more advanced, you start to think like, oh, okay, why am I doing a lock on this person when I could stab them, right? Like, we both have daggers. And at that point, you open a door, right? You say like, well, come on in. There's a party going on in here, and you introduce these concepts of like, oh, well, there are different uses of force, right? They probably understand it, but it's not at the forefront when they're swinging a sword on day one, and they can get further and further in the more they want to look like it. The more down the rabbit hole they want to go down, they can understand what the actual effects of these things are. And I think what I'm realizing is that I'm becoming a lot like the old martial arts teachers I had when I was younger, who were thinking about how to teach someone, but also to curate or guide their use of force. And I'm thinking about like old Chinese masters, right? In a world without guns, and you have just hand weapons, maybe bows and arrows, but like you're teaching someone and you're increasing their combat capabilities, right? And they could potentially be a force in their communities. So if you're a martial arts instructor, you're thinking, okay, not only do I have a responsibility to teach this person, or like if I choose to, right, like who do I teach? But if I teach them, I need to also guide them down this path of thinking like, okay, what is an acceptable use of force, right? What is the purpose of this? Why do we use force in society? Those types of things. And so I haven't been thinking about it so much in a use of force context, so much as like, how do we think about kind of addressing the problems of masculinity today? Like, and using HEMA as that tool, as that secret, like kind of, spoonful of sugar with your medicine, right? Like, I'm going to talk to you very quickly about why you think that this is an appropriate response to this situation, but in actuality, historically, something else might have happened. So I think if I had to like distill it, it would be kind of a spoonful of sugar, and if you access it on day one, you're going to get a very cartoonized version that kind of meets you where you are. But as you go along, you will have been fed enough medicine that you should probably be able to piece it together and understand kind of what the value of certain components of violence are, and should start restructuring and rethinking the framework of violence that you're operating under. That's my spiel.
I like that spiel. The thing that I was going to add to it is I think there's a real difficulty that I know I struggle with as somebody who primarily teaches weapon arts, of, on the one hand, keeping ourselves honest about what it is that we do and what it is that we are practicing. I do think that even when we are doing it for happy, fun playtime, it's useful and important to acknowledge that we are playing with toys that do lethal harm. This isn't a happy, fun poking stick. This is a stabbing stick that can murder somebody. And that's not, and that doesn't mean that we have to be dour and serious and all the time, because that's bullshit. But it changes the experience of fighting, and it changes the tactical parameters of what you're doing. You know, if I point a sword at another person and they don't perceive that sword as something that can do them harm, they're not going to make the same kinds of tactical choices that were expected in the sources. They're not going to deal with it in ways that are predictable in the same way that the material I'm teaching from expected. You know, I can't, teaching somebody to sword fight if there is no fear of the sword is a really weird exercise in stick fighting. That I have no personal interest in doing, and I have no personal interest in perpetuating. I think it's important for people to be like, yeah, no, so this is a stabby thing, and if you walk onto the point of it, you're going to have a real bad time.
Agreed. Yeah.
And your knowledge of the fact that there is a stabby thing pointed at you is going to affect your behavior and is going to affect how you respond to your opponent, and it informs the entire communicative dance of the sword fight, and it's really important. The flip side of that is that I don't want to glorify violence. And this is where it gets sticky, because on the one hand, I teach stabby murder violence. Like, my favorite thing is knife fighting, and knife fighting is gross. Knife fighting is not nice. Knife fighting is utterly fucking terrifying, and people get harmed no matter what. And I love it. And how do I communicate my love of that and the joy of it without glorying in the harm aspect, without teaching people that hurting others is good and desirable, and without tapping into all of the toxic masculinity baggage that Charles has been talking about as well. So I end up playing a lot with, on the one hand, recognizing that what we do is fun and it brings us joy, and part of the scariness and the challenge of it is part of that joy. It's you know, it's the joy of being really, really alive when you maybe might not be otherwise. And I do a lot of, like, just really matter of fact talking about anatomy. Like, I will tell people, you know, and this cut, which kind of comes down at this angle, if somebody's not armored that way, that's probably gonna hit the clavicle and may get at the subclavian artery, and that's a real good way to make somebody bleed out. You know, we're probably not trying to chop their arm off. We're probably just trying to create enough blood loss that they go into hypovolemic shock or decide that they don't want to fight anymore. These are conversations that we have. But it's difficult to have those without sensationalizing and without getting into what I see all the time in self-defense and what I see all the time in HEMA. And one of the things that I think both Charles and I are invested in addressing, which is not getting people who are really into the warriorly aspects of the violence and are like, oh yeah, man, I only do the murder stuff because that makes me tough. And because that is problematic, and that taps into the other thing that Charles was talking about, which is that, like, as we make people more competent at doing violence, we give them power and we give them influence in their community. And we are responsible to a certain degree for the kinds of citizens that those people become. So it matters. And I think it's a really complicated question that I don't think we're all going to come up with the same answer to. I don't think we should all come up with the same answer to. And I wish that everybody in HEMA thought about more. because it's at the core of how the practice of our art and the joy and the fun of it also interfaces with the reality of us doing violence for work or for play in a culture that's got a really wonky relationship to it. Oof, big weight on shoulders.
Yeah.
I'm gonna jump in with another question real quick.
Please.
Eric asks, do you find it generally true that the more someone pines for our historical context, the worse they understand it? I think you may have just answered that.
I would say that is true more often than not, in my experience. Or what I find interesting is that the people who tend to really pine for the ye olde times, even if they do have a very good academic understanding of it, because some people do, they often have very particular fantasies about where they would end up in the existing power hierarchy. And I think that's more where things get dicey, is that the people that want to be there are the people that assume that they would be part of the folks in charge, that they would be at the top of the heap. And my experience is, and this might be entirely inaccurate, is that the people that do that the most often are people who have not really experienced not being at the top of a power hierarchy in their regular lives. And they don't maybe understand that, like, there's a difference between being a straight white engineer in the modern US and being a duke or a count in the Middle Ages. like these things are not analogous, but they get treated like they are. Charles,
Okay, so
thinking face.
no, well, okay. So it's interesting. Actually, your response surprised me because I like the content I agree with, but I think my perspective is different in the sense that, like, you know, I generally don't interact with these piners from a position who of like an outsider. Like I don't feel it, right? And that's why I don't think I don't think I see the same angle that they're taking when they're using historical context as kind of like almost a weaponization. I think is how I'm understanding it. That there are people out there, at least what I'm getting from that perspective is that there are people out there who are going to use historical context as a tool to try to push values in the modern context that I don't see, that I generally don't see. And I push my own content and I see people giving me great sources, great feedback, all that stuff. But I don't see people saying like, hey, Charles, you don't belong in this place because, historically, people like you don't belong, right? That kind of weaponization. Maybe not that exact scenario. But yeah, I definitely, so I think I have a different perspective, but I don't think it's actually conflicting with what you're saying, that there are definitely people out there who think of historical context as a power fantasy. It's just a power fantasy that they go back and like, yeah, of course I'd be a duke and, I would do these things like X, Y, and Z, and, like I'd be powerful and, it's a little bit gross. It's actually very gross. I see it in the armor crowd, I think. I don't want to but and I'm very aware of it as I start to armor up. Like when I wear it, I know it's a thing. I know it's a thing that when you wear armor, people associate things with you. So I definitely see it, that there's a gross power fantasy that's going on. Actually, I've tried to direct some of my research towards undermining the notion of like knights as these like kind of Victorian era, paragons of virtue. Really what I like to portray like primary sources. Let me just pull the book out because it's just my jam right now. Le Jouvencel, basically it's a knight, and he just describes all the stuff he did during the later half of the 100 Years' War. And there's a lot of looting, like a lot of
So
looting.
much looting.
Yeah, just robbery, looting, just, hey guys, just come with me, let's take this town, we're gonna get a ton of loot. Like how it frames their mind, how it frames their tactical decisions. I like anecdotes like that because it's a primary source. It's like essentially unimpeachable for the piners, right? But it is also kind of intuitively, we understand that humans were not different then, that they were not nobler back then,
Yes.
that you've got the same mix of trash that you do now, right? Some of it's good trash, but most of it's just trash. And so the same motivations that motivate people nowadays are still operating back then. They want to increase in social status. They want money. Some people do have morals, right? And these form conflicts within the same person, and that's very understandable. Like, and when these anecdotes come out, you understand the mindset someone's in, right? Like, oh man, I got this great prisoner, right? And he's worth a lot of money, right? But I also promised him that he could go home. So, the conflict is inside that person, and it's not like it's not I don't want to receive my view of knightly virtue or of chivalry from romances, or even worse, Victorian iterations of those romances, right? So like that. Being able to get access to those primary sources that seem more realistic, or at least provide a grittier version, but not one that is on the other end of the spectrum as well, right? Because there's the other perspective, which is just like, yeah, we're all murdering each other in the mud, like
Grimdark, 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 grimdark.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I've been looking for. These kinds of like firsthand accounts, and critically analyzing them to push back against this type of pining, because usually the pining is very like vague.
Yes.
Back then, people did this.
If you want to have some real fun with that, especially given the kinds of things that people tend to pine for, Crusade Chronicles are fucking great.
Yeah.
First-hand accounts of the Crusades just make you go, oh, buddy.
Yeah.
Like, and it's earlier period than what a lot of us work on. The First Crusade is the 11th century. I'm so bad at dates.
It's the end of the 11th, like 1090 something. Yeah.
Yeah.
That I only know this because I'm playing Crusader Kings 3.
And then there's actually, do I still have it on my shelf? I had a fun, I can't find it right now. I reorganized things. I've got a fun like Penguin edition of a couple Crusade Chronicles of Joinville and Villardun, who were French Crusaders in like the first 4 Crusades. And they're really great for getting into the head of somebody who went on these. And there is piety and virtue and so on, but there's also like, we camped outside Constantinople and they weren't very nice to us, so we went and sacked the city instead. And you're like, that was the biggest Christian city at the, guys, that was not noble. And it's because so many of the people of the kind of inaccurate idealization of that period tends to circle around the Crusades in interesting ways. Those can be, I'm being very diplomatic, those can be a really, really lovely corrective to that. Actually, one sec. I do have it. I'm just going to hold it up so that people can find this thing, because it's like super cheap and easy. Chronicles of the Crusades. It's a Penguin paperback, so you can get it for like $15 apparently. And these are, you can tell I haven't since I was studying it for school, because it's still full of tabs. But it's a great way to kind of get your head around some of the the primary sources that really give you a sense of what people's mindset was when they were going to war, when they were doing stuff. And it's the same thing with Le Juvenal that Charles is giving us. Is just like, man, go read the stuff that these people wrote, and you will be delighted and appalled by how human it is.
Is this a good
and that
time
should be informing our HEMA.
Is this a good time to do our bait and switch for text analysis?
We have 9 minutes.
Okay, all right. Well, this is my last bit then. Because what's interesting to me though is that like when people go back to the past, how uncritically they evaluate these sources, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, oh yeah, like this guy said he was acting in the name of God. Well, okay, good. Well, people back then acted in the name of God, and how it just forms like
because they said they
bad.
were.
Yeah, because they said they were, right? Like, you know, we have this problem in KDF,
Yeah.
right? Like our sources say it's the best martial art ever. Well, clearly it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, if you only go back to history looking for things, you're gonna find it. You're gonna find it no matter what. You know. So you know, I had to push back on some thread, you know, that someone posted that about warrior culture. They went back into the past trying to find examples of warriors, and you know, like I think if you go back looking for a mindset, you can find someone who has it, and you can weave together a thread of those sources. I think a lot of time needs to be spent just reading something without knowing what you're looking for. Like, you know, read Christine de Pizan. You know, what does she tell you to bring to a siege? All right, fine, fuck. Pickaxes, ladders, you know, and you'll eventually come across like really good sources where you're like, oh, okay, you know, this is telling me stuff that I don't necessarily want to hear. Right. And if you don't have time in your research for that, then you're just going out looking and getting what you want to find. You know, I want to find historical warriors and brutality and, you know, maybe sexism, maybe throwing you know, just a pinch of racism. And that's what I come back with. Hey guys, like I came back from the library. This is what I found. I found exactly what I was looking for. And I think if for those of you who are interested in context, you know, try to think about things that are beyond sources and things that are beyond, or if you do look at, especially biographies, right? Like really clamp down and think about what this person is trying to do. It's very valuable for understanding what's important to that person, but it's not necessarily like like a documentary of their life by Ken Burns, right? It's definitely made in a way to paint that person in a certain light. It only reaches your eyes because it's gone through this massive selection process.
And that sets me up really nicely to briefly kind of gesture towards how that affects our sources as well. Because there's this real tendency to look at martial arts manuals as complete and comprehensive records of an art as it existed. And if things were not included, it's because there was an oops. Rather than very carefully curated selections that are going to give a particular impression to a reader. And sometimes we gloss over, they're like, well, you know, this was basically for marketing. So you put all of your cool stuff in it. And you're like, yeah, but also there's stuff that they didn't explain because there was a presumption that everybody already knew it. It was part of the cultural soup that people were already swimming in, you know. It would be like I'm not gonna write a modern fitness book that starts by explaining what running shoes are or what a gym is. These are things everybody knows or can find out very easily from a source that is not me. And also the techniques that they chose, the images that they chose to represent that, all of that is going to be a reflection of the author's views on violence. To kind of circle this back to our putative topic.
That's right.
It's gonna show how they chose to solve problems within that kind of sphere of violence that Charles was talking about. It's going to show their priorities in terms of the postury, presentation, communicative side of violence, or the breaking people's faces side of violence. It's going to demonstrate where they fit into that kind of use of force spectrum, whether they're trying to present a broad range of options for dealing with a bunch of situations, or whether they're really concerned with one narrow example that is quite at one extreme or another, or only covers one small section of that spectrum. And it's really worth kind of stepping back and looking at a text as a piece of writing with a goal, and trying to figure out what that goal is specifically when it comes to perspectives on violence, and seeing what that can tell us about how we should be practicing and how we should be training from that source. You know, if I've got a book that is primarily a bunch of Messer disarms, maybe that's not something that I should be throwing into my, you know, my tournament context where I can disarm, but I only get points for hitting the other guy, as a for instance. I'm going to stick with this one good example.
Hey, Kaja.
There we go. My mouth is starting to run out of steam.
Just wanted to give you guys a 3-minute warning, and then I can wrap us up. So if you guys want to do like your last thoughts, I also took screenshots of the questions so I can send them to you guys on Facebook, and then we can do like a post discussion wrap up of the questions that we missed. Is that cool with you guys?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. And you can answer them on your own time. You don't have to do them tonight, obviously, but just send it our way whenever you're free. And yeah, last minute thoughts, wrap ups when you're ready.
Yeah, I guess I could say a few things. So I think generally, at least within KDF, the big question is, why are we doing this? Who does this? What are their goals? I think more generally, for people who study historic martial arts, understanding the context is very valuable. Sometimes it might be easier in certain contexts where the source will pretty reliably have sources discussing the context of your technical source. And I think it's important because it determines how people view the art, but also in more practical terms, what your starting parameters are. So how close are you? How are you armed? It also forms what a suitable ending objective or ending state is for an exercise. And so, you know, usually we assume when we fight with swords that killing the other guy is the objective, but there are other objectives out there. If you read a lot about violence, try to keep a broad eye, focus on your time period, but also generally, you know, learn about interesting violent contexts. For me, my project right now is just gang violence. How does violence operate in an area without state authority? So I think it's very important. I wish people would do it more. And I think that there's room to push back on, I think what I've just learned is a kind of a weaponization of historical context. I think it's very important that people study this, and they also study this from different perspectives, people with different life experiences, people who have understandings of gender or culture in different ways, so that we can better access the past. Because the past, I try to treat it as this alien culture which I'm learning, not something that I'm like a direct descendant of. Like, obviously I'm an Asian guy. I don't feel like I'm a descendant of, you know, 15th century Europeans. I'm not. It's this alien culture, and I think that's the best way to approach it. So that's just kind of my parting thing. It's important we get different perspectives, we get diversity in who studies it and who writes about it, and that can help shape how we practice HEMA.
I love everything Charles said, and I feel bad going after it. It's such a beautiful summary. I want to second all of the wonderful contextual and perspective stuff that he said, and I think I want to pull us back to what martial arts is, what we do is. And from my perspective, martial arts is the practice of problem solving through violence. And in order to effectively solve a problem, in order to effectively untangle a social or a physical challenge in front of us, we have to understand the full scope of the problem. We can't just understand what sword the other person has and how tall they are and how fast they can move, but we also need to understand why they're there, what they want from this confrontation, what external pressures are pushing in on them. Like, is there, are they broke? Are they doing this for money? Is there a potential loss of social status or social security that comes out of backing down from this fight? Are they trying to establish their position in a new organization, whatever? Like, why are they here? What do they want? What led up to this confrontation that we have? All of those are pieces that we need to use to solve a problem. And if we want to be good practitioners, if we want to be good martial artists, then we really need to think about all of the shit that happens around the physical side of violence. And hopefully in this 2 hours of rambling, Charles and I have given some ideas on how that could potentially be approached. And I really love the emphasis that Charles has placed throughout this, and I really want to thank him for this, of also that idea of martial arts as something that creates and reinforces and interacts with power dynamics, which is something that violence does as well, and how that creates responsibilities in ourselves as practitioners and as teachers to really think about how we're using violence and how we're empowering people to use and to think about it, because that is going to have knock-on effects into our world, and the way that we engage with the past has knock-on effects. We've seen this very much in modern culture. And so I think all of these questions that we've been asking over the past 2 hours that seem abstract and geeky and academic on the one hand are actually really important fundamental things that we need to think about and that we need to have a solid grasp of as people who have decided, for whatever reason, to regularly engage with violence as a pastime or even as a profession. Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. I assume you've been a great audience. I know there have been puns, so like obviously you were the best.
Oh my gosh, so many puns, and I will definitely highlight them later, Kaja, so you will not miss out.
Please send me a digest of all the puns.
100% will do that. Well, first off, as a wrap up, I want to say thank you so much, Kaja and Charles, for being on this and being willing to have this workshop with us. I think having you guys here is just amazing. It was a wonderful 2 hours. I know I definitely speak, because I'm speaking now, for like the other 38 people on this call, because I think we have another 20 on Facebook Live, but this conversation could definitely go for another 2 hours, and I think people would still want to hear from you guys more. So thank you for your time and preparing to have this discussion with us. I want to thank our wonderful volunteers on the call, Mike Jarvey and Brent Wang, for being our moderators. Volunteers is the blood of Swordsquatch in any event that we do. Seriously, thank you so much, you guys, for dedicating your time to this event. And I know it's Saturday only. We had Purple Heart sponsor us tonight. I believe it's 9, so sadly, officially, the code is no longer available, the S2020. That doesn't mean that you can't go hit up some of the wonderful products that they still had on there available. Other than that, if you had fun today, consider throwing Swordsquatch a donation at paypal.com/PayPalMe/Swordsquatch. This event has been completely free. We wanted to make sure that accessibility was there for everyone for this year and for the future. Also, if you are in the US, don't forget to vote this November. And that's it for us tonight. Swordsquatch still continues one more day tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. with Jess Finley. I believe she's on this call. She's not already gone to bed yet. With Messer and Pony Stuff at 10 a.m. We have, following that, Longsword Biomechanics with Miss Brittany Reeves. And then Andrew Somlio will have solo practice at 5 p.m. and he will wrap up this year's Swordsquatch. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. Thank you, lovely instructors and volunteers. And I hope you all have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.